When you see the emergency session called at the UN Security Council this morning, when you watch Chinese and Russian diplomats demanding immediate meetings and invoking international law, you might think this is just another diplomatic protest. But what you're actually witnessing is something far more consequential. You're watching the moment when two of the world's most powerful nations realize that their carefully constructed anti American coalition isn't worth the paper it's written on. The frantic calls for UN intervention, the desperate appeals to international legal frameworks, the coordinated statements from Beijing and Moscow, these aren't signs of strength. They're signs of institutional panic. For the better part of 2 decades, China and Russia have been building what they called a multipolar world order. They positioned themselves as the guardians of sovereignty, the defenders of smaller nations against American hegemony, the architects of an alternative power structure that would challenge Washington's dominance. Venezuela became the crown jewel of this project, a testing ground for whether economic partnerships, military cooperation, and ideological alignment could create a protective shield around countries that defied the United States. Today, that shield lies in pieces on the floor of a Brooklyn detention center where Nicolas Maduro awaits his arraignment. The speed and totality of the collapse should terrify strategists in both Beijing and Moscow because it exposes the fundamental weakness of their entire approach to global power projection. They built their influence on the assumption that American restraint was permanent, that the post-Cold War rules-based order would continue indefinitely, and that economic leverage could substitute for military deterrence. Trump's Venezuela operation has shattered all three assumptions in the span of 48 hours. Let's start with China, because their reaction tells you everything you need to know about how unprepared they were for this moment. Xi Jinping's foreign ministry issued not one but two statements condemning what they called hegemonic acts and blatant use of force. They demanded the immediate release of Maduro and called for the U.S. to stop toppling the government of Venezuela. The language is strong, the condemnation is fierce, but notice what's missing. There's no threat of retaliation. There's no announcement of Chinese naval deployments to the Caribbean. There's no economic sanctions package targeting American interests. It's all rhetoric and no substance, which is exactly how you sound when you've been caught completely off guard by an adversary willing to call your bluff. The Chinese have spent years portraying themselves as Venezuela's most reliable partner. They became the country's largest oil buyer, its biggest creditor, and its primary economic lifeline. Beijing provided over $60 billion in oil-backed loans, created joint ventures in the energy sector, and offered diplomatic cover at international forums. In exchange, they expected to build a model of South-South cooperation that could be exported to other developing nations as an alternative to Western economic integration. The relationship was supposed to demonstrate that countries could prosper without bowing to American pressure, that Chinese investment and Russian military support could create a protective umbrella for authoritarian allies. But when the moment of truth arrived, when American special forces were literally knocking down doors in Caracas, all of that economic partnership proved worthless. China couldn't protect its investment. China couldn't protect its ally. And most importantly, for the broader implications, China couldn't project power into what it had claimed was its sphere of influence. The gap between Chinese rhetoric about global leadership and Chinese capacity for global intervention has never been more stark. Russia's position is even more embarrassing because they had positioned themselves as the military guarantor of the Maduro regime. Moscow provided air defense systems, anti-ship missiles, and technical expertise. Russian military advisors were reportedly on the ground helping maintain Venezuelan military equipment right up until the moment American forces arrived. Putin's government signed strategic coordination agreements and pledged to stand ready to support their South American ally. None of it mattered. The sophisticated air defense systems didn't track the incoming American aircraft. The Russian advisors didn't provide early warning of the assault. The Strategic Coordination Treaty didn't coordinate anything except Russia's inability to respond to the crisis. The Russian Foreign Ministry's statement was a masterpiece of frustrated impotence. They called the American action an act of armed aggression and demanded immediate clarification, as if they were filing a complaint with a customer service department rather than responding to the capture of a strategic ally. The ministry reaffirmed solidarity with the Venezuelan people and condemned the unfounded pretext for American intervention. But solidarity and condemnation are what weak powers offer when they can't provide actual assistance. Strong powers deploy assets, weak powers deploy press releases. What makes this moment historically significant is that both China and Russia are now being forced to confront the reality that their model of anti American coalition building has failed its first major test. For years, they've been selling smaller nations on the idea that alignment with Beijing and Moscow provides security against American pressure. They've offered economic incentives, military hardware, and diplomatic protection in exchange for ideological loyalty and strategic positioning. Countries like Iran, North Korea, Syria, and Cuba have bought into this framework, believing that membership in the anti-American club provides insurance against regime change operations. The Venezuela precedent destroys that insurance policy permanently. If China and Russia couldn't protect Maduro despite years of investment and public commitment, what confidence should other authoritarian leaders have in their ability to provide meaningful deterrence? The psychological impact of this failure will ripple through every capital where leaders have been counting on Beijing and Moscow to balance American power. They're all asking the same question this morning. If it can happen to Venezuela, why can't it happen to us? The timing of China's response is particularly revealing because it exposes the constraints that limit their options. Beijing issued their strongest statements about hegemonic behavior and violations of international law, but they conspicuously avoided any mention of economic retaliation against the United States. They didn't threaten to dump U.S. Treasury bonds. They didn't announce tariffs on American goods. They didn't even suspend bilateral trade negotiations. The reason is simple. China needs the American market more than America needs Chinese cooperation on Venezuela. Economic interdependence, which was supposed to be China's strategic advantage, has become a strategic vulnerability that prevents them from responding proportionally to American military action. Russia faces a different but equally limiting constraint in Ukraine. Moscow simply cannot afford to open a second front in Latin America while they're burning through resources and manpower in Eastern Europe. The war in Ukraine has revealed the limits of Russian military capacity, and Putin cannot risk further depletion of his forces to defend a South American ally. This creates a cruel irony for Russian strategy. Their most significant military operation in decades has made them less capable of protecting their global network of authoritarian partners, not more capable. The UN Security Council meeting that China and Russia have demanded will become a theater of their own ineffectiveness. They'll deliver passionate speeches about sovereignty and international law. They'll introduce resolutions condemning American intervention. They'll rally support from other developing nations who fear being the next target. But ultimately, they'll discover that international law is only as strong as the willingness of powerful nations to enforce it. When the most powerful nation decides to write new rules, the old rules become suggestions. This is where the broader implications for global order become clear. The post-1945 international system was built on the assumption that major powers would resolve their differences through diplomatic mechanisms rather than unilateral military action. The UN Charter, the Geneva Conventions, and the various treaty frameworks that govern international relations all depend on voluntary compliance by the world's strongest militaries. When the United States decides that compliance is optional, the entire system becomes optional. China and Russia are now faced with a choice between escalation and accommodation. Escalation would mean accepting economic costs and military risks that neither country is prepared to bear. Accommodation would mean acknowledging that American power remains supreme and that their alternative world order was always more aspirational than actual. Neither option is politically palatable for leaders who have built their legitimacy on promises to challenge American hegemony. The cascade effects are already visible in how other countries are recalibrating their foreign policy positions. European allies who might normally condemn unilateral American military action are offering only muted criticism, recognizing that opposition to Washington carries costs they're not prepared to pay. Latin American countries are choosing sides more carefully, understanding that rhetorical support for sovereignty principles won't protect them if they find themselves in America's crosshairs. Middle Eastern and African nations are quietly reassessing their relationships with China and Russia, wondering if those partnerships provide genuine security or merely the illusion of security. Iran's condemnation of the Venezuela operation carries a particular edge of nervousness, because Tehran understands that they could easily be the next target of American intervention. The Islamic Republic has been counting on Chinese economic partnerships and Russian military cooperation to deter American action, but the Venezuela precedent suggests that neither Beijing nor Moscow has the capacity or willingness to prevent regime change operations. Iran's statements about flagrant violations of international law sound less like principled opposition and more like desperate appeals for a protection that may not exist. The North Korean response follows a similar pattern. Pyongyang denounced the American hegemony-seeking act and called it evidence of the rogue and brutal nature of the United States. But beneath the bluster, Kim Jong-un's regime must be calculating whether their nuclear deterrent is sufficient to prevent the kind of operation that toppled Maduro, or whether they need to seek additional security guarantees from allies who have just proven unable to protect their closest partners. Cuba's reaction is perhaps the most telling because the island nation has the longest experience of any country in managing American pressure while maintaining authoritarian rule. President Diaz-Canel called the Venezuela operation a criminal attack and organized solidarity rallies in Havana, but Cuba also understands better than anyone that symbolic support from distant allies cannot substitute for effective deterrence. The Cuban leadership spent decades learning to survive without Soviet protection after 1991, and they're now confronting the possibility that they may have to survive without Chinese and Russian protection as well. For China, the Venezuela crisis represents a fundamental challenge to their Belt and Road Initiative and their broader strategy of economic diplomacy. Beijing has been arguing that economic partnerships provide a more sustainable foundation for international influence than military alliances or coercive diplomacy. The Chinese model was supposed to offer developing nations prosperity without political conditions, investment without interference, and growth without the security dilemmas that come with great power competition. The collapse of that model in Venezuela forces China to confront uncomfortable questions about the relationship between economic influence and strategic deterrence. You can build all the ports and pipelines you want, you can provide all the loans and investment packages you can afford, but if you cannot protect those investments when a rival power decides to eliminate your partner, then your economic diplomacy becomes a very expensive form of charity. Chinese strategic planners are undoubtedly asking themselves whether their entire approach to global influence needs to be reconsidered. Russia faces an even more immediate credibility crisis because military cooperation was supposed to be their comparative advantage in the competition for authoritarian allies. While China offered economic incentives, Russia offered security guarantees. Moscow positioned itself as the provider of last resort for regimes that needed protection against Western pressure. Russian weapons, Russian advisors, and Russian diplomatic cover were supposed to create deterrence against exactly the kind of operation that just succeeded in Venezuela. The failure of Russian deterrence in Venezuela calls into question every other security commitment that Moscow has made to authoritarian partners. If Russian air defense systems couldn't protect Caracas, can they protect Damascus? If Russian military advisors couldn't prevent regime change in Venezuela, can they prevent regime change in Syria or Belarus or any other country where Putin has promised protection? The credibility of Russian security guarantees, which was already damaged by the mixed results in Ukraine, has now been further undermined by the complete failure to deter American action in Latin America. The coordination between China and Russia in calling for the UN Security Council meeting demonstrates that both countries understand the severity of the precedent that has been set. They're trying to rally international opposition to American unilateralism, not because they believe it will reverse what happened in Venezuela, but because they need to prevent it from becoming a repeatable template for future operations. If the international community accepts the Venezuela intervention as legitimate or even as simply irreversible, then every other American adversary becomes a potential target for similar treatment. But their options for meaningful response remain severely limited by the same factors that prevented them from protecting Venezuela in the first place. China cannot afford a full-scale economic confrontation with the United States over a South American country that represents less than 5% of their total oil imports. Russia cannot afford a military confrontation with the United States while they're already engaged in an expensive and inconclusive war in Ukraine. Both countries are discovering that the constraints of geography, economics, and competing priorities make it impossible to project sufficient power into Latin America to challenge American operations. The emergency session at the UN Security Council will likely become a forum for venting frustration rather than coordinating an effective response. China and Russia will deliver speeches about the importance of sovereignty and the dangers of unilateralism. They'll probably introduce a resolution condemning the American intervention and calling for Maduro's immediate release. The United States will veto any such resolution, demonstrating once again that the UN system cannot constrain American power when American leadership decides to act unilaterally. This dynamic highlights one of the fundamental weaknesses in the Chinese and Russian approach to challenging American hegemony. They've been trying to use American-created institutions and American-written rules to limit American power, but those institutions only function when the Americans choose to be constrained by them. When Washington decides that the rules no longer serve American interests, the rules simply cease to apply. China and Russia are learning that you cannot defeat hegemonic power using hegemonic institutions. The broader implications for international relations are profound because we're witnessing the transition from a rules-based international order to what might be called a power-based international order. For the past several decades, international politics operated on the assumption that even the strongest countries would generally abide by established legal frameworks and diplomatic procedures. Military intervention was supposed to be a last resort, used only after diplomatic options were exhausted and with some form of international authorization. The Venezuela operation suggests that the United States is no longer willing to be constrained by those assumptions. If American leadership decides that diplomatic procedures are too slow, too cumbersome, or too likely to produce unsatisfactory results, they're prepared to bypass them entirely. If international legal frameworks prevent the achievement of American objectives, those frameworks will be ignored rather than respected. This represents a return to a more naked form of great power competition, where capability matters more than legitimacy and effectiveness matters more than procedure. China and Russia are now confronted with the reality that their entire strategy for constraining American power has been based on faulty assumptions. They assumed that economic interdependence would prevent American military action. They assumed that international law would provide meaningful constraints on American behavior. They assumed that their own economic and military partnerships could create effective deterrence against American intervention. All three assumptions have proven incorrect, leaving both countries scrambling to develop alternative strategies for protecting their interests and their allies. The Venezuela precedent also creates a demonstration effect that extends far beyond Latin America. Every country that has been considering whether to align with China and Russia or accommodate American pressure is now seeing concrete evidence of what happens when the moment of truth arrives. Economic partnerships with Beijing and security guarantees from Moscow were insufficient to prevent regime change in Caracas. The lesson for other potential American targets is clear. If you're going to defy Washington, you better have more reliable protection than what China and Russia can provide. This recalculation is already visible in the carefully worded responses from countries that might normally be more supportive of Chinese and Russian positions. European nations are offering only token criticism of American unilateralism while privately acknowledging that they have no desire to be on the wrong side of a superpower willing to use military force to achieve its objectives. Middle Eastern countries are reassessing their relationships with Iran and other American adversaries, recognizing that association with targets of American intervention carries risks that their Chinese and Russian partners cannot mitigate. The ultimate irony is that China and Russia's response to the Venezuela crisis may actually accelerate the erosion of the international order they claim to defend. By calling emergency UN meetings and appealing to international law, they're highlighting their own inability to provide meaningful alternatives to American power. They're demonstrating that when push comes to shove, their anti-American coalition is more rhetorical than substantive, more aspirational than operational. The frantic diplomatic activity we're seeing from Beijing and Moscow represents the last gasps of a strategy that has fundamentally failed. They built their approach to challenging American hegemony on the assumption that they could create alternative institutions, alternative partnerships, and alternative rules that would gradually erode American dominance. The Venezuela operation has shown that alternative institutions are meaningless when the dominant power chooses to ignore them. Alternative partnerships are worthless when they cannot provide effective deterrence, and alternative rules are irrelevant when they cannot be enforced. What we're witnessing is not just the failure of Chinese and Russian policy toward Venezuela. We're witnessing the collapse of the entire conceptual framework that has guided their challenge to American hegemony for the past 2 decades. The multipolar world order they promised their allies was always more theoretical than real, more rhetorical than practical. When tested by American power willing to act decisively and unilaterally, that order revealed itself to be an elaborate facade concealing the continued reality of American dominance. The question now is whether China and Russia can develop more effective strategies for constraining American power, or whether they'll be forced to acknowledge that the unipolar moment never really ended. The desperate appeals to international law and frantic calls for UN intervention suggest that they don't yet have answers to that question. They're discovering that it's much easier to criticize American hegemony than to create viable alternatives to it, much easier to promise protection to authoritarian allies than to actually provide it when the moment of crisis arrives.